The scars on Hazel Freeman's face burned worse in the winter cold. The raised ridges of damaged skin, aching as snowflakes settled against her cheek, and melted into tiny rivers of ice water that traced the path of old wounds. She pressed her gloved hand against the right side of her face, the side that had been torn open 2 years ago when a spooked horse had kicked her into a fence post that splintered on impact, driving jagged wood deep into her flesh. The doctor in Sacramento had done what he could, stitching her back together with trembling hands while her father held her down, and her screams echoed through the small medical office. But no amount of careful needlework could restore what had been destroyed. The scars ran from her temple down to her jaw, thick and ropey, pulling her skin into an unnatural landscape of peaks and valleys that made children stare and grown men look away. It was December of 1882, and Hazel had been traveling for 3 days through the Sierra Nevada mountains, making her way toward the small town of Yosemite, California, where her aunt supposedly ran a boarding house and might offer her refuge. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving her alone on their failing farm in Sacramento with debts she could never pay and neighbors who whispered that a woman with her face would never find a husband, never have a normal life, and should probably just accept charity from the church and fade into the background of respectable society. Hazel had other plans. She sold what little remained of her father's property, packed her belongings into 2 canvas bags, and bought passage on a stagecoach heading east into the mountains. But the stagecoach had broken an axle 20 miles back, and the driver told her it would be 2 days before he could get it fixed, maybe longer if the weather got worse. The other passengers decided to wait, huddling in a roadside inn that smelled of tobacco and unwashed bodies. But Hazel had looked at her dwindling coins and made a decision. She would walk. The innkeeper had told her she was a fool, that the snow was coming down harder and a woman alone on these roads was asking for trouble. But Hazel had simply adjusted her pack, wrapped her scarf more tightly around her face to hide the scars, and stepped out into the white wilderness. She had faced worse than cold and snow. She had faced the mirror every morning for 2 years, had faced the pity and disgust in people's eyes, had faced the slow death of her dreams. A little winter weather did not frighten her. But now, as the afternoon light began to fade and the snow fell thicker, turning the world into a swirling white void where the road disappeared beneath a blanket of white, Hazel began to wonder if the innkeeper had been right. Her feet were numb inside her boots, her fingers ached despite her gloves, and she had not seen another living soul for hours. The trees pressed close on either side of the road, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally fell in soft thuds, making her jump and reach for the small pistol her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. She needed shelter. Soon. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could feel the dangerous lethargy of cold beginning to seep into her bones, making her thoughts slow and her movements clumsy. She stumbled over a hidden root buried under the snow and went down hard on her knees, the impact jarring her teeth together and sending a spike of pain up her legs. For a moment, she just knelt there in the snow, breathing hard, watching the white flakes settle on her dark coat. It would be so easy to just stay here, to let the cold take her, to stop fighting against a world that did not want her anymore. She thought about her mother, dead these 10 years from fever, and wondered if there would be anyone to mourn when Hazel Freeman finally gave up and let the mountain claim her. Then she heard it, the low nicker of a horse, somewhere ahead through the trees. Hazel forced herself to her feet, ignoring the protest of her frozen joints, and stumbled forward. The sound came again, closer now, and then she saw a warm glow of light filtering through the snow, the unmistakable flicker of lamplight from a window. She had found a cabin. Relief flooded through her so intensely that she nearly fell again, but she caught herself against a tree and pushed forward, her eyes fixed on that precious light. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from thick logs with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A lean-to beside it sheltered 2 horses and what looked like a cow, all 3 animals watching her approach with mild curiosity. Hazel made it to the front door and raised her fist to knock, but her arm felt so heavy, her movements so slow. She managed 3 weak taps against the wood before her legs gave out, and she slumped against the door frame, sliding down to sit in the snow that had drifted against the threshold. The door opened so quickly that she nearly fell backward into the cabin. Strong hands caught her shoulders, and a man's voice, deep and concerned, said, "Good God, you are half frozen. Come inside quickly now." Hazel tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate. She felt herself being lifted, carried across the threshold into blessed warmth that made her skin prickle and burn as feeling began to return to her frozen extremities. She was set down gently in a chair near a roaring fireplace, and rough but careful hands began unwrapping her scarf, removing her snow-crusted coat, pulling off her frozen gloves. What in the name of all that is holy were you doing out in this storm? The voice asked, and Hazel finally focused enough to look at the man who had saved her. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of summer grass. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though right now his expression was pure concern as he knelt before her chair and began unlacing her boots. "The stagecoach broke," Hazel managed to say through chattering teeth. "I was walking to Yosemite. Did not realize how far it was." "Yosemite is still 12 miles from here," the man said, carefully removing her boots and then her socks, examining her feet with the practiced eye of someone who knew about frostbite. "You would not have made it through the night if you had kept walking. Your toes are white here and here, but I think we caught it in time." He stood and moved to the fireplace, pouring water from a kettle into a basin. "This is going to hurt," he warned, "but we need to warm your feet gradually. Too fast and you will damage the tissue worse." Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice. Her scarf had slipped down when he removed her coat, and she became suddenly, painfully aware that her scars were fully visible in the bright lamplight. She reached up with trembling fingers to pull the scarf back into place, but the man had already returned with the basin of lukewarm water. He set it down and reached for her feet, then paused, his eyes traveling up to her face. Hazel felt her stomach clench, waiting for the familiar reactions. The flinch, the quickly averted gaze, the careful, pitying expression people wore when they tried to pretend her scars did not bother them, while everything in their body language screamed revulsion. But Henry Quinlan, though she did not know his name yet, simply looked at her scars the same way he had examined her feet, with calm, professional assessment, and then met her eyes directly. "You have been through something," he said simply. "But we all carry our marks. Come on, feet in the water. Trust me, I know it hurts, but it is necessary." Hazel lowered her feet into the water, and pain shot up her legs so intense that she gasped and gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles went white. The man, this stranger who had taken her in from the storm, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Breathe through it," he said quietly. "You are strong. I can see that. Anyone who walks 12 miles through a blizzard has steel in their spine. You can handle a little warm water." Something about his matter-of-fact tone, the complete absence of pity in his voice, made Hazel want to cry for the first time since her father's funeral. But she blinked back the tears and forced herself to breathe slowly, in and out, while the pain in her feet gradually subsided from agony to a more manageable throbbing ache. "My name is Henry Quinlan," the man said, moving to stir something in a pot that hung over the fireplace. The smell of stew filled the cabin, making Hazel's stomach clench with hunger. "I run cattle in these mountains during the summer, but I winter here in this cabin. It is not much, but it is warm and dry." "Hazel Freeman," she managed to reply. "And I am grateful for your help, Mr. Quinlan. I will not impose on you long. Once the storm clears, I will continue to Yosemite." "The storm is not going to clear for at least 2 days," Henry said, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "And even if it did, you are in no condition to travel. Your feet need rest and you need to warm up properly. You will stay here until you are well enough to make the journey safely." He brought the bowl to her, along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. Hazel took it with shaking hands, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the details of his face. He had a scar too, she realized. A thin white line that ran along his jaw, barely visible against his tanned skin. And his hands, when he handed her the bowl, were rough and calloused, marked with the small cuts and scrapes of hard work. Everyone carried their marks, he had said. Maybe he actually meant it. Hazel ate slowly, feeling warmth spread through her body with each bite of the rich, hearty stew. Henry busied himself checking her feet again, changing the water in the basin for slightly warmer water, all while maintaining a respectful distance and a steady stream of calm, practical conversation. "I came out here 5 years ago," he said, responding to a question Hazel had asked about how he ended up in these mountains. "My family had a ranch in Texas, but my older brother inherited when my father died, and there was not much for a second son to do except hire out as a cowhand. I worked for different ranches, saved my money, and finally bought a small herd and some grazing rights up here. It is not easy work, and the winters are harder than anything I knew in Texas, but it is mine. I answer to no one but myself and the cattle." "That sounds like a good life," Hazel said quietly. "It is lonely sometimes," Henry admitted. "But I have the animals, and in summer there are other ranchers and cowboys around, a few families settled in the valleys, and every few weeks I ride into Yosemite for supplies and news." "What about you, Miss Freeman? What brings you to these mountains?" Hazel hesitated, the spoon halfway to her mouth. She could tell him the truth, that she was running away from a life that had become unbearable, that she hoped to find some kind of purpose or peace with an aunt she barely remembered. Or she could offer a polite fiction, the kind of genteel half-truth that people used to avoid uncomfortable topics. But something about Henry's straightforward manner, the way he had looked at her scars without flinching, made her want to be honest. "My father died 6 months ago," she said. "Left me with nothing but debts and a farm that would not sell for enough to cover them. My mother's sister runs a boarding house in Yosemite, or she did last I heard. I am hoping she can give me work, a place to stay, a fresh start." "Because of your face," Henry said, and it was not a question. Hazel's hand went automatically to her scars, her fingers tracing the familiar ridges. "People look at me differently now. I cannot get work in Sacramento. No one wants a scarred woman serving their food or minding their children. And marriage is out of the question. Men see these scars and they see damaged goods." Henry was quiet for a long moment, and Hazel braced herself for platitudes. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical. "I have never understood that way of thinking," he said. "When I look at a horse, I do not judge it by whether it has a few scars from barbed wire or a brand from a previous owner. I look at whether it has good bones, a strong heart, whether it will carry me where I need to go. Scars just mean something tried to break you and failed. That is worth respect, not pity." Hazel felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "That is a kind thing to say, Mr. Quinlan." "Henry," he corrected. "And it is not kindness, Miss Freeman. It is just truth as I see it. Now, your feet have enough color back that I think we can let them rest. You should sleep close to the fire tonight to stay warm. I will make up a pallet for you." He moved around the cabin with efficient purpose, gathering blankets and arranging them into a comfortable sleeping area near the fireplace. The cabin was a single room, Hazel realized, with Henry's own bed in one corner and a rough wooden table and chairs in the center. Shelves held supplies, canned goods, and various tools. A rifle hung above the door, and a guitar leaned against the wall near the bed. "I will sleep in my own bed as usual," Henry said, noting the direction of her gaze. "You have my word as a gentleman that you are safe here, Miss Freeman. I know we just met, and you have no reason to trust me, but I was raised proper by a good mother who would haunt me from the grave if I ever treated a woman with anything less than complete respect." "I believe you," Hazel said, and was surprised to realize it was true. There was something fundamentally decent about Henry Quinlan, something in the way he moved and spoke that put her at ease despite the strangeness of the situation. She settled into the makeshift bed, still dressed in her underclothes, and a spare shirt Henry had lent her while her own clothes dried by the fire. The blankets were heavy and warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and sage. Through the single window, she could see the snow still falling thick and fast, and she sent up a silent prayer of thanks that she had stumbled upon this cabin instead of freezing to death in the white wilderness. "Henry," she said into the darkness after he had extinguished all but one lamp and settled into his own bed. "Yes, thank you, for taking me in, for not asking me to cover my face or sit in shadow, for treating me like a person instead of a tragedy." There was a pause, and then Henry's voice came through the darkness, warm and sincere. "There is a lot I could say to that, Hazel Freeman, but I will just say this. When I look at you, I see a woman who walked through a blizzard rather than give up on her dreams. I see someone with courage and determination. The scars are just part of your story, not the whole of it. Anyone who cannot see that is a fool." Hazel closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without the weight of shame pressing down on her chest. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, morning light filtering through the window to illuminate a world transformed into a pristine white landscape. The snow had stopped falling sometime in the night, leaving behind drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. Henry was already up, dressed in heavy work clothes, tending to a skillet on the stove. He turned when he heard her stirring and offered a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Morning. How are your feet?" Hazel wiggled her toes experimentally. They were sore but functional. The dangerous white patches of frostbite had turned to healthy pink. "Better. Much better. Good. We were lucky. Another hour out in that storm and you would have lost toes for certain, maybe worse. Breakfast is almost ready. After we eat, I need to check on the animals and clear some snow from the lean-to. You should stay inside and rest your feet." But when breakfast was finished, Hazel found she could not simply sit idle while Henry worked. Despite his protests, she bundled up in her now dry clothes and followed him outside, where the world had become a wonderland of white punctuated by the dark green of pine trees, heavy with snow. The cold air bit at her scars, making them ache, but Hazel ignored the discomfort and helped Henry carry feed to the horses and the cow, who regarded them with patient, liquid eyes. Henry showed her how he had set up water buckets with heated stones beneath to keep them from freezing, and explained his system for storing hay and grain to last through the winter. "You know a lot about surviving up here," Hazel observed, forking hay into the manger. Had to learn fast my first winter, Henry said with a rueful grin. Made every mistake you can imagine. Nearly lost half my herd because I did not account for how deep the snow could get in the high meadows. Now I bring them down early, keep them close where I can watch them. They worked in companionable silence, and Hazel found herself studying Henry when he was not looking. He moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own body, his strength evident but not showy. And he was handsome, she had to admit, in a rough-hewn way that suited the mountains. More than that, he was kind. Not in the performative way some people were kind to her now, making a show of their tolerance for her appearance, but in a genuine, natural way that made her feel normal for the first time since the accident. When they went back inside, Henry put the coffee pot back on the stove and pulled out the guitar she had noticed the night before. "Do you play?" Hazel asked. "Some. My mother taught me when I was a boy. Said every man should know music as well as hard work, that it kept the soul from getting hard along with the hands." He strummed a few experimental chords, adjusting the tuning. "Do you sing, Miss Freeman?" "Not well," Hazel admitted, "but I like to listen." Henry played, and his rough cowboy's hands moved over the strings with surprising delicacy, coaxing out an old ballad about lost love and mountain roads. His voice when he sang was deep and true, filling the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Hazel found herself watching his face as he played, the concentration in his expression, the way his eyes closed during certain passages as if he was lost in the music. This was a man of depths, she realized, not just a cowboy surviving in the mountains, but someone with poetry in his soul. When he finished, setting the guitar aside, Hazel said impulsively, "That was beautiful." Henry looked pleased but bashful, a faint color rising in his tanned cheeks. "Thank you. It is nice to have someone to play for besides the horses. They are not much for musical criticism." They spent the rest of the day in comfortable domesticity. Henry working on mending a saddle while Hazel, despite his protests that she was a guest, helped prepare a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives. Henry told her about growing up in Texas, about his mother who died when he was 16 and his father who followed her 2 years later, about the brother he had not spoken to in 3 years because of a bitter argument over their father's will. Hazel told him about Sacramento, about her mother's death when Hazel was 8, about learning to run the farm alongside her father, about the accident that had changed everything. "It was my own fault," she said, staring into the fire. "I knew that mare was spooky, that she had a tendency to kick when startled. But I got careless, walked up behind her without calling out first. She caught me with both back hooves, sent me flying into the fence. I remember the sound of wood breaking and then pain like nothing I had ever felt. And blood, so much blood." Henry listened without interrupting, his green eyes steady on her face. "The doctor said I was lucky to be alive," Hazel continued. "Said if the wood had struck 2 inches to the left, it would have killed me instantly. But at the time, and for a long time after, I did not feel lucky. I felt ruined. My father tried to tell me it did not matter, that I was still his daughter and still beautiful to him, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He knew what it meant, how much harder my life would be." "Do you wish it had killed you?" Henry asked quietly. "That day, I mean." Hazel considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. In the darkest moments when I catch someone staring or hear children whisper about the monster woman, but mostly no, I am still alive. I still have hopes and dreams, even if they look different than they did before. I would rather live with scars than not live at all." "That is good," Henry said, "because the world would be poorer without Hazel Freeman in it, scars and all." The way he said it, matter of fact and sincere, made Hazel's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something deeper, more dangerous. She had told herself she would never feel this way again, that the accident had closed the door on romance and love. But here in this small cabin, with snow falling outside and firelight dancing on the walls, she felt something awakening that she had thought was dead. The second day passed much like the first, a comfortable rhythm of work and conversation. Henry ventured out to check his nearby cattle, finding them huddled in a sheltered valley, and Hazel spent the time tidying the cabin and attempting to bake biscuits with the limited supplies available. They turned out dense and slightly burned, but Henry ate them with every appearance of enjoyment, and they laughed together over the minor culinary disaster. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Henry finally asked the question Hazel had been expecting since she arrived. "Will you tell me what you are really running from, Hazel?" She looked at him, surprised. "I told you. My father's death, the debts, no work in Sacramento." "That is all true," Henry agreed. "But there is something else. I can see it in your eyes sometimes when you think I am not looking. A sadness that goes deeper than scars or money troubles." Hazel was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to share. But she had been honest with Henry so far, and he had given her nothing but understanding in return. "There was a man," she said finally, "before the accident. His name was Thomas Carter. We were courting, had an understanding. Nothing official, but everyone knew we would marry. He was a clerk in town, educated, well-spoken. I thought he was kind." "Let me guess," Henry said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "After the accident, he was not so kind anymore." "He tried to be," Hazel said. "At first. He came to visit while I was recovering, brought flowers, said all the right things. But I could see the revulsion in his eyes when he looked at me, the way he had to force himself not to turn away. After a month, he stopped coming. Sent me a letter saying he was sorry, but he could not marry me, that his family had concerns, that it would not be appropriate given my condition." "Bastard," Henry said succinctly. Despite herself, Hazel felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Yes. But it taught me something. It showed me who people really are when the surface beauty is stripped away. Thomas Carter loved the idea of me, the pretty girl who could help his social standing. He did not love who I actually was underneath. The accident just made that clear." "He was a fool and a coward," Henry said flatly, "and if I ever meet him, I will tell him so." "It does not matter now," Hazel said, though warmth spread through her chest at Henry's fierce defense. "He married someone else 6 months later. A merchant's daughter with a substantial dowry and no scars. I heard they are very happy together." "I doubt it," Henry said. "A man like that will always be chasing something shinier, always looking for what is missing. He will never be satisfied because he does not know what actually matters." "And what actually matters, Henry Quinlan?" Hazel asked, turning to face him fully. Henry met her gaze, and in his green eyes, Hazel saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not tolerance, but genuine admiration and something deeper that she hardly dared name. "Character matters," Henry said. "Courage matters. Kindness matters, the ability to keep going when life knocks you down. Those are the things that last, that actually mean something when times get hard. And a person's face, scarred or not, does not tell you anything about whether they have those qualities. I have known plenty of pretty people who were rotten inside, and plenty of rough, damaged people who had hearts of gold." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched the scars on her face. His fingers traced the raised ridges with a gentleness that brought tears to Hazel's eyes. "When I look at these," Henry said softly, "I do not see ruin or damage. I see survival. I see strength. I see beauty in every scar, because each one is proof that you refuse to give up, that you are still here fighting. And that is the most beautiful thing in the world to me." Hazel felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks, soaking into the damaged tissue of her scars. But for once, they were not tears of shame or grief. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of being truly seen for the first time in 2 years. "Henry," she whispered, and then could not find any other words, but words were not necessary. Henry leaned forward slowly, his intentions clear, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Hazel did not pull away. She met him halfway, and when his lips touched hers, gentle and warm and infinitely careful, she felt something inside her break open like spring after a long winter. The kiss was brief, chaste, but it held a world of promise. When they separated, Henry rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her scarred cheek. "I have been falling in love with you since you stumbled to my door half frozen and still tried to be polite," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it is too soon to say such things, that we have only known each other 3 days, but I am a straightforward man, Hazel Freeman, and I do not see the point in hiding what I feel." "I have been falling too," Hazel admitted, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her face. "I did not think I could feel this way again, did not think anyone would want me after what happened." "Then you were thinking wrong," Henry said firmly. "I want you, not despite your scars, not even because of them, but because of who you are. The brave, determined, kind woman I have come to know these past few days. That is who I am falling in love with." They sat together by the fire, holding each other, while outside the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, adding to the drifts that surrounded the cabin in a white cocoon. The world beyond the cabin walls might as well not have existed. There was only this moment, this man, this unexpected possibility of happiness that Hazel had thought was lost to her forever. On the third morning, the sun rose in a clear blue sky, and the snow finally stopped. Henry woke early and went outside to assess the situation, returning with the news that the road should be passable in another day or so, once some of the snow had a chance to melt. Hazel felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief because she needed to get to Yosemite, to find her aunt and start building her new life. Disappointment because it meant leaving this cabin, leaving Henry, returning to a world that would judge her scars instead of seeing past them. Henry seemed to sense her conflicted feelings. Over breakfast, he said carefully, "You are still planning to go to Yosemite." "I have to," Hazel said. "I need to find my aunt, see if she can give me work. I have so little money left, Henry. I cannot impose on you any longer." "You are not imposing," Henry said quickly. "You are welcome to stay as long as you like, longer, forever if you wanted." Hazel's heart leaped, but she forced herself to be practical. "We have known each other 3 days. You cannot make that kind of offer based on 3 days." "Why not?" Henry challenged. "I know what I feel. I know what I see when I look at you. Why should I wait weeks or months to say what is already true?" "Because life is more complicated than feelings," Hazel said, though it hurt to be the voice of reason when her heart was screaming at her to accept, to stay, to take this chance at happiness. "You have a life here, a business. I have nothing. I cannot come into your home with nothing to offer, dependent entirely on your charity. That is not fair to either of us." Henry was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You are right. You are proud and you want to stand on your own feet. I respect that. So here is what I propose. You go to Yosemite. Find your aunt, see if there is work for you there. But while you are doing that, think about whether you might want something different, because I am going to court you properly, Hazel Freeman. I am going to ride into Yosemite every week to see you, bring you flowers, take you to dinner at whatever passes for a restaurant in that town. And when you are ready, when you are sure, I am going to ask you to marry me. And if my answer is no, Hazel asked, though they both knew it was a hypothetical question. "Then I will accept that and wish you well," Henry said, "but I do not think your answer will be no. I think you feel this too, this certainty that we are meant to find each other. 3 days or 3 months, what does time matter when you meet someone who sees you truly?" He was right, and Hazel knew it. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it was something from romantic novels and fairy tales. But this was not quite love at first sight. It was something deeper. Recognition. Two damaged people finding each other in the wilderness and realizing they fit together in a way that made both of them whole. "Court me then," Hazel said, and smiled at the way Henry's face lit up. "But I warn you, I am difficult and stubborn, and I make terrible biscuits." "I will take my chances," Henry said, and leaned across the table to kiss her again. They spent one more day and night in the cabin, and it felt different now that they had acknowledged what was growing between them. There was a sweet tension in the air, an awareness of each other that made even simple tasks feel charged with meaning. When their hands brushed reaching for the same cup, when their eyes met across the room, Hazel felt electricity shoot through her. Henry was careful to maintain propriety, sleeping in his own bed while Hazel took the pallet by the fire, but the distance felt simultaneously too far and necessary. They were both aware that they were playing with fire, that the attraction between them could easily overwhelm good sense if they let it. On the fourth morning, Henry saddled one of his horses, a gentle mare named Clover, and helped Hazel pack her few belongings. The ride to Yosemite would take several hours, and Henry insisted on accompanying her to make sure she arrived safely. As they rode through the snow-covered landscape, Hazel marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few days. She had left Sacramento as a woman with no future, running away from pity and rejection. She was arriving in Yosemite as a woman who had found unexpected hope, who had met a man who saw her scars as marks of strength rather than ruin. Yosemite was a small town, barely more than a wide spot in the road with a few dozen buildings clustered around a main street. There was a general store, a small hotel, a saloon, a church, and various other businesses catering to the loggers, miners, and cattlemen who worked in the surrounding mountains. Henry helped Hazel find her aunt's boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure at the edge of town with a sign reading Fletcher House hanging above the door. Hazel dismounted and stood looking at it, suddenly nervous. What if her aunt did not remember her? What if there was no room, no work? As if sensing her anxiety, Henry took her hand and squeezed it. "Whatever happens, you are not alone. Remember that." Hazel nodded and walked up to the door, Henry following a respectful step behind. She knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the same brown eyes Hazel remembered from childhood. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, then stopped, her eyes widening. "Hazel, little Hazel Freeman." "Hello, Aunt Margaret," Hazel said, and felt relief wash over her at the recognition in her aunt's voice, at the lack of horror when Margaret's eyes took in her scars. Margaret Fletcher pulled her into a fierce hug. "Good Lord, child, I heard about your father. I wrote to you, but the letter must not have reached you. Come in out of the cold." She ushered them both inside, into a warm parlor that smelled of baking bread and lemon polish. The boarding house was clean and well kept, with comfortable furniture and cheerful curtains on the windows. "I am sorry I did not write back," Hazel said. "Things were complicated after Papa died. I had to sell the farm to pay debts, and I thought maybe I could come here, find work if you had any." "Of course I have work," Margaret said immediately. "I can always use help running this place, especially in winter when my usual girl goes to stay with her family in Sacramento. But who is this?" She looked at Henry with open curiosity. "Henry Quinlan, madam," Henry said, removing his hat politely. "I have a cattle operation in the mountains. Miss Freeman took shelter at my cabin during the storm a few days ago. I wanted to make sure she reached Yosemite safely." Something in Margaret's eyes sharpened, and Hazel knew her aunt had picked up on the undercurrent between them. But Margaret simply nodded and said, "That was kind of you, Mr. Quinlan. Would you like to stay for coffee before you ride back?" Henry glanced at Hazel, who nodded slightly, and he said, "That would be nice, thank you." They sat in Margaret's kitchen, drinking strong coffee and eating fresh gingerbread while Hazel explained her situation more fully. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when Hazel was done, she reached across the table and took her niece's hand. "You will stay here as long as you need," Margaret said firmly. "Family takes care of family, scars or no scars, and there is plenty of work. I need help with cooking, cleaning, managing the guests. It does not pay much, but you will have room and board and a little extra for your own needs." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes for what felt like the 100th time in the past few days. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. You do not know what this means to me." "I think I do," Margaret said gently. "I know what it is like to feel like you have nowhere to go. My late husband, God rest him, took me in when I was young and desperate with nowhere to turn. It is my privilege to do the same for you." Henry finished his coffee and stood. "I should be getting back before dark. Miss Freeman, might I have a word with you before I go?" They stepped out onto the front porch, where the afternoon sun was already beginning to sink toward the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. "You are settled then," Henry said. "It seems so. Aunt Margaret is kind. I think I will be happy here, at least for now." "Good." Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I made this for you last night. I wanted you to have something to remember me by during the week." Hazel unwrapped the paper to find a small wooden carving of a horse, beautifully detailed despite the simple tools Henry must have used to create it. "It is lovely," she breathed. "It is Clover," Henry said, "the mare you rode today. I thought she could remind you that you always have a way to come back to the cabin if you want. Clover is yours now. I will board her at the livery here in town. If you need anything, if you want to visit, you can ride her up the mountain." Hazel looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answered prayer she had not known to pray. "You are giving me a horse." "I am giving you freedom," Henry corrected, "and a standing invitation. Come see me whenever you like, Hazel Freeman. I will be waiting." He kissed her then, there on the porch of her aunt's boarding house in the fading afternoon light, and Hazel kissed him back with all the feeling she could not put into words. When they separated, both were breathing hard, and Henry's eyes were dark with barely restrained emotion. "I will see you next week," he promised. "I will come on Saturday. May I take you to dinner?" "You may," Hazel said, and watched as he mounted his horse and rode away down the main street of Yosemite, turning once to wave before disappearing around a bend in the road. Margaret was waiting inside with a knowing smile. "So," she said, "tell me about this cowboy who looks at you like you hung the moon." Hazel laughed and found herself telling her aunt everything, about the storm, the cabin, the 3 days that had changed her entire world. About Henry's words in the firelight, about how he saw beauty in her scars instead of ruin. Margaret listened with the wisdom of a woman who had lived through her own share of heartbreak and joy. When Hazel finished, she said simply, "That man loves you. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he stood close to you like he could not help himself. You are going to marry him, I think." "Maybe," Hazel said, touching the wooden horse in her pocket. "If he asks, if I am brave enough to say yes." "You walked through a blizzard alone," Margaret said. "You survived an accident that should have killed you. You left everything you knew to start over in a strange place. I think you are brave enough for anything, Hazel Freeman. The next few days settled into a new rhythm. Hazel worked hard at the boarding house, learning Margaret's systems, meeting the various guests who passed through. There were loggers coming down from the high camps, a few miners prospecting in the mountains, a traveling preacher, and a young schoolteacher who had come to start a small school in the town. Some people stared at Hazel's scars. Some asked rude questions. But Hazel found that Henry had given her something precious in those 3 days at the cabin. He had given her the ability to see herself differently, to understand that her scars did not define her worth. So when people stared, she met their eyes calmly. When they asked questions, she answered briefly and moved on. She was still Hazel Freeman, still the woman who had walked through a blizzard and survived. The scars were just part of her story. On Saturday, as promised, Henry rode into town. Hazel saw him from the upstairs window where she was changing the linens in one of the guest rooms, and her heart leaped at the sight of him on his big bay horse, riding down the main street with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. She rushed to finish her work, then changed into her best dress, a dark blue wool that Margaret had helped her alter to fit better. She brushed her hair and pinned it up, then paused at the mirror, looking at her reflection. The scars were still there, still prominent, still the first thing anyone would notice. But Hazel found that she could look at them now without the crushing weight of shame. Henry had changed that. He had shown her that she was more than her scars, and that there were people in the world who could see past surface damage to the person underneath. Henry was waiting in the parlor, hat in hand, talking easily with Margaret about weather and cattle prices. He looked up when Hazel came down the stairs, and his face lit up in a way that made her feel beautiful despite everything. "Miss Freeman," he said formally, though his eyes were warm, "you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. Shall we?" Yosemite had a small restaurant attached to the hotel, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who served surprisingly good food considering the limited ingredients available in winter. Henry had reserved a table by the window, and they sat looking out at the snow-covered street while they ate roast chicken and winter vegetables. They talked easily, catching up on the week's events. Henry told her about a close call with a mountain lion that had been stalking his cattle, and how he had managed to scare it off with warning shots and a lot of noise. Hazel told him about the various guests at the boarding house, including the traveling preacher who had tried to pray over her scars until Margaret had firmly shut him down. She told him that God did not make mistakes, Hazel said, smiling at the memory. That my scars were part of God's plan and not his business to fix. He did not know what to say to that. "Your aunt is a wise woman," Henry said. After dinner, they walked down the main street, bundled against the cold, their breath making white clouds in the air. The sun had set, but a full moon was rising, turning the snow-covered landscape into a world of silver and shadow. Henry reached for Hazel's hand, and she let him take it, their gloved fingers intertwining as they walked. It felt right, natural, like something they had been doing for years instead of just over a week. "I missed you," Henry said quietly. 5 days felt like a year. "I missed you too," Hazel admitted. "It is strange. I spent 2 years learning to be alone, to not need anyone else. And then you come along and suddenly being alone feels wrong. That is how I feel too." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her. "Hazel, I know I said I would court you properly, take my time, do this right. But I am not a patient man by nature, and every day away from you feels like torture. So I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, because I am serious as death." Hazel's heart was pounding. "What is it?" "Come back to the cabin. Not as a visitor, not as someone taking shelter from a storm, but as my wife. Marry me, Hazel Freeman. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you that your scars do not matter, that you are beautiful and worthy and loved. Let me give you the life you deserve, the happiness that bastard in Sacramento stole from you." Hazel stared at him, her mind reeling. It was too fast. They had known each other barely more than a week. This was crazy, impulsive, everything her practical nature told her to resist. But her heart was singing a different song. Her heart remembered the firelight in the cabin, remembered Henry's gentle hands on her frozen feet, remembered the way he had looked at her scars and seen beauty instead of damage. Her heart knew what her head was still trying to accept, that she had found something rare and precious, and that walking away from it in the name of caution would be the greatest mistake of her life. "Yes," she heard herself say, and watched joy flood Henry's face. "Yes, I will marry you." Henry let out a whoop of pure happiness that echoed down the empty street, then picked Hazel up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her dizzy, his cold lips warming against hers, his arms tight around her waist like he would never let her go. "Tomorrow," he said when they finally broke apart. "We will get married tomorrow. I do not want to wait another day." "Tomorrow," Hazel agreed, and felt a bubble of pure joy rising in her chest. Aunt Margaret will be shocked, but Margaret was not shocked at all. When they returned to the boarding house, breathless and giddy with happiness, and told her the news, she simply smiled and said, "I wondered if it would be this week or next. Clearly, you are both decisive people. The church will be available tomorrow afternoon if Pastor Williams agrees, and I am sure he will. He loves a good romance." Pastor Williams did agree, and the next day, in the small wooden church at the edge of Yosemite, Hazel Freeman married Henry Quinlan. She wore a dress borrowed from Margaret, simple but elegant, and carried a bouquet of dried flowers that Mrs. Chen had saved from the previous summer. Henry wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, his green eyes bright with love and promise. There were few guests. Margaret stood up with Hazel, and the livery owner stood up with Henry. Mrs. Chen attended, along with the young schoolteacher and a few of the regular boarding house guests. But the small crowd did not matter. What mattered was the look in Henry's eyes when Hazel walked down the aisle, the steady warmth of his hand when he took hers, the certainty in his voice when he said his vows. "I promise to love you all my days," Henry said when it was time for his vows. "To see you truly, scars and all, and to cherish every part of you. I promise to be honest with you, to work beside you, to build a life with you in these mountains. And I promise that every day for the rest of my life, I will remind you that you are beautiful, because you are, Hazel. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Hazel's own vows were simpler. "I promise to love you, to trust you, to be your partner in all things. You saw me when I thought no one would ever see me again. You gave me hope when I had none. I promise to spend my life showing you that your faith in me was not misplaced." Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry kissed her there in the little church while the small congregation applauded. And Hazel felt something inside her heel, some deep wound that she had thought would never close finally beginning to knit together. They spent their wedding night at the cabin, riding up the mountain through the snow in the late afternoon light. Henry had prepared for this, though he tried to deny it. There were fresh flowers on the table, impossible to find in winter, but somehow he had managed it. The cabin was warm and clean, the bed made up with fresh linens, and a special dinner waiting that he must have prepared that morning before riding down to Yosemite. "You were very confident I would say yes," Hazel teased, looking at the preparations. "I was hopeful," Henry corrected. "And terrified you would say no. But I wanted to be ready. just in case. They ate dinner by firelight, and then Henry carried her to bed, gently and carefully, as if she was something precious that might break. And in the warmth of their marriage bed, with snow falling softly outside and the fire burning low, Henry kept the promise he had made in the church. He showed her with his hands and lips and whispered words that she was beautiful, that he loved every part of her, that the scars did not matter. And for the first time since the accident, Hazel Freeman, now Hazel Quinlan, felt truly whole. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Hazel learned the rhythms of life in the mountain cabin, learned how to care for the cattle and horses, how to preserve food and mend fences, and all the 100 other skills necessary for survival in the wilderness. Henry was a patient teacher, and they worked together as a team, each supporting the other. When spring came and the snow finally melted, Henry took Hazel up to the high meadows to see his cattle spread out across the green grass, to see wildflowers blooming in impossible profusion, to see the mountains in their full glory. And Hazel fell in love with this land the way she had fallen in love with Henry, quickly and completely, until she could not imagine living anywhere else. In late summer, Hazel realized she was pregnant. She told Henry one evening as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply, and watched as understanding and joy flooded his face. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression awed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Hazel asked, though she could already see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Henry said. "Hazel, you have given me everything. A wife I adore, a home that feels complete, and now a child. I am the luckiest man in California." "Even though your wife has scars?" Hazel asked, and though she was mostly teasing, there was still a small part of her that needed to hear his answer. Henry turned to face her fully, his green eyes serious. "I see beauty in every scar," he said, echoing the words he had spoken that first night in the cabin. "Each one is a reminder that you survived, that you are here with me, and now those scars will be part of our child's history too. Part of the story we tell about how their mother was the bravest, strongest woman in the world." Hazel cried, but they were good tears, happy tears, the tears of a woman who had found her way home. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, delivered by Margaret, who came up to the cabin to help with the birth. It was a long labor, frightening at times, but when Hazel finally held her baby in her arms, looked down at his red, wrinkled face and shock of dark hair, she knew that every moment of pain had been worth it. They named him James, after Henry's father, and he had his father's green eyes and his mother's determination. Henry was besotted from the moment he first held his son, cradling the tiny baby in his work-roughened hands with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. I do not know what I did to deserve this." "You saw me," Hazel said simply, "when no one else would. That is what you did." As James grew from baby to toddler, the cabin grew too. Henry built an addition, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. Other families had begun to settle in the area, drawn by the good grazing land and the beauty of the mountains. A small community formed, ranchers and farmers helping each other through hard times and celebrating together during good times. Hazel became friends with the other women, and found to her surprise that her scars were barely remarked upon. These were frontier women, practical and tough, and they cared more about whether someone could help birth a calf or preserve vegetables than what they looked like. For the first time in years, Hazel felt like she belonged. 2 years after James was born, Hazel had a daughter they named Rose. She had Henry's green eyes and Hazel's brown hair, and she was as sweet-tempered as James was serious. Henry adored both his children equally, spending his evenings teaching James about cattle and horses, while Rose sat on his lap and played with his hair. Margaret visited often, especially in the summers, and she loved to sit on the cabin porch with baby Rose in her arms while James ran around the yard chasing chickens and generally creating chaos. One such evening, as the sun was setting and Henry was out checking the cattle, Margaret said to Hazel, "You have built a good life here." "I have been blessed," Hazel agreed, watching James try to catch a butterfly. "You were brave," Margaret corrected. "When you left Sacramento, you could have given up. You could have accepted what people told you, that your scars made you worthless. Instead, you walked through a blizzard to find a better life. That takes courage." "I was desperate," Hazel said honestly, "not brave." "Sometimes they are the same thing," Margaret said wisely. "And you found a man who deserved you. That Henry of yours, he is 1 in a million." "I know," Hazel said softly, and touched her scars, which had faded slightly over the years but would always be part of her face. "He told me once that he saw beauty in every scar. I did not believe him at first, but he has spent every day since proving it was true." Henry returned as the last light was fading, and he came straight to Hazel, kissing her forehead and sitting down beside her on the porch steps. James immediately climbed into his lap, chattering about the butterfly he had almost caught, and Rose reached for him from Margaret's arms. Looking at her family, Hazel felt a wave of contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was everything she had thought she would never have. A husband who loved her, children who looked at her with uncomplicated affection, a home where she belonged. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, part of the journey that had led her to this moment. That night, after the children were asleep and Margaret had retired to the guest room, Henry and Hazel sat by the fireplace together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "You ever regret it?" Hazel asked quietly. "Marrying a woman with scars, having children with her?" Henry pulled back to look at her, his expression incredulous. "How can you even ask that? Hazel, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Those scars brought you to my door in a blizzard. If that accident had never happened, you might still be in Sacramento, might have married that fool Thomas Carter, might never have ended up here. I would not change a single thing about you or our life together." "Even when people stare," Hazel pressed. "Even when we go into town and I see the whispers, the pointing. Even then," Henry said firmly. "Because I know what they do not. I know how you walked through a blizzard alone. I know how you work alongside me every day, never complaining about the hard life we have here. I know how you sing to our children, how you laugh at my terrible jokes, how you look at sunset with wonder in your eyes. I know who you are, Hazel Quinlan, and you are extraordinary. Anyone who cannot see past your scars to the amazing woman underneath is missing out." Hazel kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. And as she did, she realized that she finally believed him. She finally understood that her worth was not determined by her appearance, that she was valuable and loved and whole exactly as she was. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were hard winters when the cattle suffered, dry summers when water was scarce, seasons when money was tight and worry kept them up at night. But there were also years of plenty, of healthy calves and good prices at market, of dancing at community gatherings and long summer evenings when the whole family sat outside watching the stars emerge over the mountains. James grew into a strong, capable young man who helped his father with the cattle and inherited Henry's gift with horses. Rose proved to have her mother's determination and her father's kind heart, and she shocked the community by announcing at 15 that she wanted to be a teacher, that she was going to Sacramento to attend normal school. "A teacher," Henry said, pride evident in his voice. "That is a fine ambition, Rose. Mother taught me to read," Rose said. "And she showed me that what people look like does not matter, that everyone deserves a chance. I want to teach children that too." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's words. She had never tried to hide her scars from her children, had answered their questions honestly when they were young and curious. And somehow, without meaning to, she had taught them the lesson Henry had taught her, that beauty came in many forms, and that character mattered more than appearance. When Rose left for Sacramento, Hazel cried, but they were proud tears. Her daughter was going to make a difference in the world, was going to teach children to see past surfaces to substance. James married at 22, bringing home a rancher's daughter named Emma, who had brown eyes and a practical nature that reminded Hazel of herself. They built a cabin on the far side of Henry's property, and James took over more and more of the day-to-day operation of the ranch as Henry's hair turned gray and his joints began to ache on cold mornings. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 75, and the whole community mourned her. She left the boarding house to Hazel, who sold it and used the money to expand the ranch, buying more cattle and more grazing rights. Through all of it, Henry remained Hazel's constant companion and greatest supporter. As they aged together, their love deepened into something richer than passion, a profound partnership built on decades of shared experience. They knew each other's thoughts, could communicate with a glance, moved together through their days with the easy rhythm of two people who had become one. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Henry gave Hazel a gift. It was a painting, commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through the area the previous summer. The painting showed Hazel sitting on the porch of their cabin, her face turned toward the mountains, the afternoon sun highlighting her scars. "I wanted you to see what I see," Henry said as Hazel stared at the painting with tears running down her face. The artist was good. He captured it perfectly. And he had. The scars were clearly visible in the painting, but they did not dominate the image. Instead, the eye was drawn to Hazel's expression, to the contentment and strength in her face, to the way she sat with easy confidence. The scars were simply part of the whole, neither hidden nor emphasized, just one element of a complete picture. "I am beautiful," Hazel said wonderingly, looking at the painting. "You always were," Henry said. "I am just glad you finally see it too." They hung the painting over the fireplace, and it became a treasured family heirloom. When Rose visited with her own children, she would point to the painting and tell them about their grandmother who had walked through a blizzard, who had refused to let scars define her, who had built a life of purpose and love in the mountains. James and Emma had 4 children, and Henry and Hazel delighted in their grandchildren, in the noise and chaos they brought to the ranch. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate family gatherings, and Sundays became a tradition when everyone would come together for dinner, the table groaning with food, voices raised in laughter and argument and storytelling. When Henry turned 60, he finally admitted that the ranch work was getting too hard for him, and he officially turned over management to James. But he could not quite give up the land he loved, so he spent his days working on smaller projects, mending fences, training horses, and teaching his grandchildren the skills he had learned over a lifetime. Hazel continued to manage the household, though as the years passed, Emma took on more and more of those responsibilities. Hazel found she enjoyed having more time for other pursuits. She started writing down the family's history, wanting future generations to know their story. She taught her granddaughters to sew and cook, and her grandsons to see past surfaces to substance. One winter evening, when Hazel was 65 and Henry was 67, they sat together by the fireplace as they had done countless times before. The cabin was quiet, the grandchildren gone home, James and Emma in their own cabin across the way. It was just the two of them, gray and creaky but still deeply in love. "You remember the night we met?" Henry asked, staring into the fire. "How could I forget?" Hazel replied. "I was half frozen, terrified, certain my life was over." "I took one look at you and knew I was going to marry you," Henry said. "Even though you were covered in snow and shaking with cold, even though we had just met, I just knew. I thought you were going to send me away once you saw my scars in the light," Hazel admitted. "I thought you were just being kind, that when morning came, you would make some excuse to get rid of the damaged woman in your cabin." "Instead, I fell in love," Henry said simply. "Best decision I ever made, walking out to the lean-to that night and hearing you knock on my door. Best decision I ever made was walking through that blizzard," Hazel countered. "If I had stayed at the inn, if I had waited for the stagecoach, I never would have found you." "We would have found each other somehow," Henry said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and steady, blanketing the world in white. But inside the cabin, all was warm and safe, a lifetime of love contained within these log walls. "I see beauty in every scar," Henry said softly, repeating the words he had spoken 30 years ago. "That is still true, Hazel. It will always be true." Hazel touched her scars, feeling the familiar ridges under her fingertips. They were part of her now, part of her story, part of what had brought her to this place. She no longer saw them as a curse or a tragedy. She saw them as Henry did, as proof of survival, as marks of strength, as part of a journey that had led her to love. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Henry replied. "Always have, always will." They continued to sit together as the fire died and the room grew darker. Two people who had found each other in a blizzard and built a life that spanned decades. They had raised children, built a successful ranch, created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. They had proved that love was not about perfection, but about seeing each other truly, accepting every flaw and scar and choosing each other every single day. As the years continued to pass, Henry's health began to decline. His joints ached constantly, and his heart sometimes beat irregularly, making him short of breath. He was 73 when the doctor from Yosemite visited and told them gently that Henry's heart was failing, that they should prepare. Hazel refused to accept it at first, insisted that Henry was strong, that he would recover. But as the weeks passed and Henry grew weaker, she finally had to face the truth. They had been given 37 years together, which was more than many people got, but it still did not feel like enough. On a clear spring morning, with the mountains visible through the window and wildflowers blooming outside, Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep, Hazel holding his hand. He was 74 years old, and he died surrounded by family in the cabin he had built, on the land he had loved. The grief was crushing. Hazel had known it was coming, had tried to prepare herself, but nothing could really prepare you for losing the person who had been your partner for nearly 4 decades. James and Emma moved into the main cabin to take care of her, and Rose came from Sacramento and stayed for 2 months. The grandchildren rallied around, making sure she was never alone, bringing her meals, sitting with her in the evenings. But in the quiet moments, when everyone else had gone, and she was alone in the big bed she had shared with Henry for so long, Hazel felt his absence like a physical wound. She would wake in the night and reach for him, only to find empty space. She would see something beautiful, a sunrise or a newborn calf, and turn to share it with him, only to remember he was not there. The first year was the hardest. But gradually, as the seasons turned and life continued its relentless forward motion, Hazel found a new equilibrium. She could remember Henry without breaking down. She could talk about their life together with joy instead of just sorrow. She could sit on the porch and watch the sunset and feel his presence beside her, a comforting ghost, a lifetime of love that death could not erase. She lived for 10 more years after Henry died. 10 years in which she watched her grandchildren grow and start families of their own, in which she held great-grandchildren and told them stories about their great-grandfather who had seen beauty in scars. She remained sharp and active until the very end, still writing down family history, still teaching the younger generation, still embodying the strength and determination that had carried her through that blizzard so many years ago. Hazel passed away in her sleep at the age of 84, peacefully and without pain. The whole community came to her funeral, and Rose delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears. "My mother taught me that our value is not determined by how we look, but by who we are," Rose said, standing at the front of the church. She survived an accident that should have broken her, walked through a blizzard that should have killed her, and built a life that inspired everyone who knew her. She showed me that scars do not diminish us. They remind us that we survived, that we are strong, that we have stories worth telling. They buried Hazel next to Henry on a hillside overlooking the valley, where they could watch over the land they had loved and the family they had built. The headstone reads simply, "Hazel Quinlan, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She walked through storms and found beauty." And every year, on the anniversary of that long-ago blizzard, the family would gather at the graves and tell the story again. The story of how Hazel had stumbled to Henry's cabin more dead than alive, how he had taken her in, and seen past her scars to the extraordinary woman underneath, how they had built a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would continue for generations. The painting still hung in the main cabin, now managed by James's eldest son. And when new family members married in, they would be shown the painting and told the story, the reminder that beauty came in many forms, that love was not about perfection, and that sometimes the greatest love stories started with someone seeing you truly when you thought no one ever would again. The cabin stood for another 50 years, a testament to Henry's skill and the life he and Hazel had built there. Eventually, it was carefully dismantled and rebuilt at a historical preservation site, where visitors could learn about life in the 1880s and hear the story of the scarred woman and the cowboy who loved her. And though Henry and Hazel were long gone, their story continued to inspire. It reminded people that everyone carried scars, visible or invisible, and that true love meant seeing beauty in all of them. It showed that strength came in many forms, that courage was often quiet and determined rather than loud and flashy, that the best love stories were built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. In the end, Hazel Freeman had walked through a blizzard and found not just shelter, but home. She had thought the cowboy would reject her, would see her scars and turn away. Instead, he had looked at her and said the words that changed her life. "I see beauty in every scar," and he had spent the rest of his life proving it was true.